Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us at this special episode of Project Censored. We are very glad to be joined again by Coyote, a member of the Defend Atlanta Forest. And we had Coyote on the show a while ago to discuss the struggle against Cop City. But for those who didn't already listen to that, I'll give you some backstory real quick. It's called Cop City because it refers to the Atlanta Police Foundation's $90 million police military compound, the largest police facility in the U.S. If it were to be built, which would potentially stretch across a full 381 acres. The facility is specifically designed to train police in quote-unquote crowd control and urban warfare tactics, and would include a fake city replicating city blocks and buildings, a so-called shoot house where cops can practice shooting civilians, plus dozens of shooting ranges, a Black Hawk helicopter pad, and a bomb detonation range, among other things. And this struggle has been ongoing for quite some time, but on January 18th, it escalated in a deadly and grotesque way when police murdered a forest defender, Manuel Tortuguita Teran. And the irony of police murdering a forest defender so that they can clear-cut the forest and learn more efficient ways to kill people is, I'm sure, not lost on folks listening. And as of the recording of this show, 6 forest defenders are still in jail, having been denied bail. And as I understand it, there are up to 20 facing terrorism charges after the violent attack by police on January 18th. And Coyote, I wanted to start with this, if we could, because there was recently an image shared by Stephen Donziger, the environmentalist lawyer, showing an affidavit that claims a forest defender was committing domestic terrorism because he was occupying a treehouse. Can you talk about these absolutely absurd charges and what forest defenders are facing after this violent attack on January 18th?
Yeah, of course. Um, so so there was an initial raid in December where 5 people were charged with domestic terrorism for being in tree houses. And then there were 2 subsequent raids in January, the second of which was the one where Tortuguita was killed by the police. And in each of these raids, people were like after the first raid, then people who were arrested on the ground were also charged with domestic terrorism. And to give people an idea of the stakes of a domestic terrorism charge, if you are found guilty of domestic terrorism, you can be in prison for up to 35 years. So part of the issue is that this the law, the way that it's being interpreted and the way that it's being interpreted, sorry, the law itself is very vague, and the way that it's being interpreted is that because the forest defenders are on this land preventing in order to protest the building of Cop City, they're considered domestic terrorists because they're preventing the construction of a necessary government facility. So like the domestic terrorism law was initially conceived of in order to as something to charge people who were, for example, perpetrators of mass shootings or people who were attacking critical infrastructure like water treatment plants or these kinds of things, right? So in this interpretation, the critical infrastructure is Cop City rather than something that might actually be critical infrastructure like a water treatment plant. And the thing that they're doing to prevent it is simply just being on the land, right? So if it were not for these domestic terrorism charges, the most that they could get these people for would be maybe a misdemeanor of trespassing, right? And the land that many of the people were arrested on isn't even the land that the APF owns. It's the land that is owned by Ryan Millsap. That's east of the river, that actually is still in court about whether or not it's a public park because there was a legally disputed land swap. So the domestic terrorism charges are pretty broad and they're very concerning. And from the perspective of many of the people who are involved with the movement and many others, it's a largely political choice. You know, by calling people domestic terrorists rather than protesters, it makes it easy to deny any of the things that they are requesting by saying like, okay, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. And it makes it easier to quell any sort of dissent because you're going to frighten everyone because nobody wants to go to prison for the rest of their life. And it makes it easier for them to like garner public support because once you start talking about terrorists, people on the right can get very incensed. And once somebody's a terrorist, they're going to be a terrorist for those people. And it's going to be very difficult to convince them otherwise. So yeah, that's I mean, we've had some lawyers from an organization called the CLDC come to talk to us about these charges. And it seems like a lot of lawyers and the National Lawyers Guild is involved in running our jail support right now. And so a lot of people are or helping, some members of it are helping our jail support. And so a lot of lawyers are thinking that the charges aren't going to hold up. And oftentimes with land defense like this, like when they give people these huge charges, they're kind of throwing the book at everyone in order to freak everyone out. But then the court case will like go on for a very long time, and eventually the charges will be dropped, or they won't be able to get anyone on the charges. So it's partially like a bluster thing in order to freak people out, and which is normal, which is part of like how the court functions in all of like in all cases, you know, giving people like the worst possible charge they can imagine in order to scare them and convince them to take a plea deal. That's pretty normal. So yeah, it's frightening, but we're doing our best to support everybody through all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is terrifying, and I can only imagine how it feels for those caught in those crosshairs, but I do appreciate you giving that context for how the system tries to scare people off from getting involved in these fights, because as we talked about the last time that you were on the show, y'all were doing such incredible work, including the community in, you know, fun actions and fun events and things that really highlighted the diversity of the community and the diversity of the forest and what a forest can be in a community space. And so that kind of inclusion and solidarity is terrifying to the powers that be. And I was curious to hear what the situation is now in the forest. I understand that that people were continued to be assaulted by police after the violent attack. And I'm curious what the situation is now in that space, in that forest, and in the you know, proposed cop city in general.
Well, the events have still been happening in the forest, so that's something that's been really like heartening. We're doing weekly potlucks and food distribution in the forest, and that hasn't stopped. So every Wednesday we're still doing these like potlucks, and people are coming in. People have come in to like help clean the forest because when the police ran their raid, they just totally trashed it. Like they left the trash everywhere, and like, you know, destroyed tents and these kinds of things, ripped open sleeping bags so that the stuffing went everywhere. So there are people who are going out and doing that kind of thing. Right now, today, like right at this moment, they're doing a children's walk. So some local preschools are going out and they're walking around in the woods. And there are like, you know, there are still people like it's kind of hard for the government to like really respond because, you know, no matter how many people they get, like there's still people who are ready to like continue resisting. Um, it is a little bit more difficult now. There's been a lot larger police presence, and also Brian Kemp declared like a state of emergency where he essentially gets like dictatorial powers where his word is law and he can call the National Guard. And so there was like, you know, there's some photos going around of like the National Guard in Atlanta. And so there are fewer people staying in the woods now. There might still be some people in trees, but I don't personally know that because everyone who is in the woods um, is being very secretive about it because they don't want to get, you know, arrested. They don't want to get, you know, pursued or targeted by the government. And so, yeah, it's becoming a little bit more intense in terms of like defense actions, but community actions are still happening.
Has there been any uh, um, have the National Guard gone in, and has there been any hostilities on their part, or they're just in Atlanta at the request of Kemp?
They're in Atlanta at the request of Kemp. They haven't gone into the woods itself. There were also the protests about the Tyree Nichols video that was released, and everything, you know, which is also a tragedy and is which was quite disturbing, and a lot of people, it was sort of just being pumped up that there was going to be these huge protests about Tyree Nichols. And I think that after everything that happened with Tortuguita, where that cop car was lit on fire and all that stuff, part of the reason why the National Guard was called was like because Brian Kemp was worried that something was going to happen with was wanting to respond like preemptively to like the Tyree Nichols protests. So I think that the National Guard is spending more of their time in town, rather than at the woods itself, you know. There's actually a neighborhood in Atlanta called Buckhead. This is something that I've been thinking about or talking about with people, which is that like Andre Dickens, for example, when he's giving his tough on crime talks and these things, he's giving them to this particular people from this particular neighborhood, which is called Buckhead, where the business owners and the landlords and all the richest people in Atlanta live. And they're the ones who are the most worried about crime. And when he's addressing them, he's talking about how crime is being reduced in Buckhead, right? And he's not talking, and it's almost like he's serving this neighborhood rather than the rest of Atlanta. And so I imagine like a lot of the issues with like the National Guard and these kinds of things are also like primarily focused on like keeping people of that socioeconomic class comfortable and not worried that their stuff is going to get messed up by protesters, rather than really even having very much to do with the forest. I think that if an encampment like the ones that existed prior to the raids like came back into the woods, we might see National Guard go into the forest. And I think that a lot of people are aware of that. So, but we have nothing but time. You know, their permits have not gone through, and they're still not able to like build and everything. So like maybe it's just a matter of time. He can only call the National Guard until February 9th unless he gets some kind of extension. So yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about the timeline as well, because as I understand it, some parts of the forest have already been destroyed, and so I'm curious what is left, and what do you feel is the timeline in terms of like, do they have a deadline, like we need to get construction rolling by this date, or what's the feeling there?
Most of the forest is not destroyed, thankfully. Some the parking lot on the eastern side of the forest, the Weelaunee People's Park, that parking lot and the path from that parking lot into the woods, which is a concrete path, those were destroyed, and a small portion of the forest was clear cut, and another small portion of the forest they cleared the underbrush, the undergrowth. So but then stop work orders were put in place, and that was stopped. In terms of the timeline of when they want to start building, I think at this point now they're 6 months behind on their timeline. So they're already really far behind. And I think that they keep telling their investors that they're going to start like in the spring of this year. But DeKalb County so far has not approved any of their work permits because of the fact that if they were to begin construction, a whole bunch of silt would go into the waterway. And so and already like some of the construction that happened in the Ryan Millsap portion, the portion that the conflict is with Ryan Millsap rather than Cop City, um, the very small amount of destruction that he did already has had effects on the water. So the fact that that's going on, I think, is going to make it more difficult for them to get permits. But unfortunately, Brian Kemp is really pushing, is sort of pressuring DeKalb County to give the permits. And also, like, you have to recall that, like, this land is in unincorporated DeKalb County, so it's not Atlanta itself. So it's a different entity that has to give the permits to the Atlanta Police Foundation. So we don't really know. We know that Andre Dickens feels really negatively about the forest defenders and these kinds of things, but there haven't been as many public statements from, like, people in DeKalb County, especially since it's unincorporated. And we know that the majority of the people in DeKalb County don't want Comp City. And so or at least in the surrounding neighborhoods. So whether or not that will impact how quickly they can get these permits, we don't really know, you know. Sorry, I wish I could tell you more than that.
No, that is good information. And I am curious, you mentioned the neighborhood surrounding, and you also mentioned the Tyree Nichols protests. And of course, this is a facility that, if it were built, would teach cops how to more effectively kill people. And of course, in the United States, that is predominantly Black men and non-white members of the community. So I'm also curious, have these kind of unfortunately time-aligned tragedies, have these brought more people in support of what y'all are doing to stop Cop City? Has there been these connections being made by members of the surrounding communities?
Well, there were, like, in regards to that, it's hard to think about it like that, since it is, like, a matter of, like, human lives, and each of these things are so personal. Like, a lot of, like, I'm sending a lot of, like, love to Tyree Nichols' family, and I hope that they can, like, find peace in the tragedy that they're going through. And I think that there have been solidarity. People who have organized vigils around the country have been putting solidarity statements about Tortuguita and about Tyree Nichols, and that, I think that this, and Tyree Nichols isn't the only person who died, like, around, like, in that same week as well. As I mean, Tortuguita and Tyree Nichols, I think, died on the same day, or it was, like, that Wednesday, or and that and there was another person in California, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, I wish I did, who was tased to death as well. And the thing is that, like, I don't know how much these things happening simultaneously add on to each other, because they're happening all the time. Like, in the past year, I think it was something like 100 people got killed by cops a month. That's multiple people a day. That's, like, almost 3 people a day. So, or it is 3 people a day, more than 3 people a day. So it's an impressive number. I think there was a lot of news about the case with Tyree Nichols because of how bad the video was. And I don't really know whether or not it's good to like, speculate about how those different pieces of news, like, impacted each other. But I do know that they're both evidence of the fact, well, like, I do know, for example, that the police chief in Memphis, originally, who was in charge of those officers, originally was working in Atlanta, and then was fired from the police department in Atlanta. because of covering up a case that had to do with the husband of another police officer, and was in charge of something called the Red Dog group in the police that was known for being like particularly violent. And so this is not just an issue that is just about Atlanta. This was an Atlanta police officer who was in charge of the officers that were involved in the Tyree Nichols case. And so, there's that, and then there's also the fact that like there were some documents that were released about the police foundation from the police foundation about the facility, where they said that they wanted 43% of their trainees to come from out of state. And so, the whole purpose of this facility is to train officers from all over the country, and we already have this kind of like violent policing culture in Atlanta. What happened with Tortuguita and what happened with Tyree Nichols are both symptoms of the same problem. It's the same sort of group of people that it's a job that attracts people who want to exert power over other people and who are willing to do so violently, and that can attract a lot of people who are pretty monstrous, and can create power dynamics in situations that are just, also monstrous. So yeah, I don't know about the news, but I do know that they are problems that are similar to each other and that are on the same page. I think something that was quite different from the two is that Tyree Nichols was truly, wasn't harming anybody, was innocent, and was kind of attacked by these officers without warning. And what's been going on in Atlanta has been just these officers. The officers have been since like the officers have been pointing machine guns at people in trees for months. Like in previous raids, they've pointed machine guns at people who are up in the tree. They've been heard on scanners asking if they can live fire at the protesters after what happened with the Molotov. And so, the officers in the case in the forest were really, they were looking for an excuse to use their guns, and we don't know truly what happened, but we do know that the group that were sent in to do the raid, and the group that ultimately shot Tortuguita, were one of the only police forces in the state that aren't required to wear body cams. And we can only like speculate whether or not that was intentional. So I mean, yeah, sorry, I'm kind of going off subject here, but it's just more evidence, I think, that with what happened with Tyree Nichols and what happened with Tortuguita are just both pieces of evidence that show that like police brutality is not a matter of like individual instances that are a problem. It's a matter of like an institution that is rotten to the core, that is culturally broken, and that needs to be disempowered, and can't be trusted any longer to care for the community. Because even if there are like, like there are friends of mine who would scoff at this, but like even if there are good cops, right? Like, the other day I saw police officers taking a homeless guy to like there was a guy who's mentally ill in my neighborhood, right? And I saw them, we watched because we didn't know what was going to happen. And we were trying to keep this guy safe, but they walked him to a gas station and then got him some food from the gas station and like gave him the food and then let him go, right? And we're like, okay, well, that's really nice of them to do that, right? But then when you look at like how the police are like rewarded in Atlanta, right? And how they're run, they have a point system. So based on like what you get, like what you do, you get different points. And so like if you answer a service call, right, you get something like half a point. Well, no, you get half a point, right? I know this. And then, but if you arrest a juvenile on the street, you get 5 points. So there's like 10 times the reward to, there's 10 times the incentive to, and then when you get all these points, then you get like incentives from your like bosses, right? So like there's 10 times the reward for arresting a juvenile, whatever that juvenile was doing, even if they weren't really harming anybody, compared to like answering a service call that where somebody actually wants the police officer to come. And like on top of that, so then when you see like this thing where the guy is like being nice to this homeless guy and is, it's like, okay, well, you're exercising your common humanity that we all exercise all the time, and that's not part of your job, and you're not getting rewarded to do that in any kind of way. And in fact, like if you're wasting time, like who knows, maybe that guy's going to get reprimanded, so like that whole thing for me, I don't know. There's just a lot of yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, I think that that's an important thing to highlight. I remember discussing this with former police captain Ray Lewis, who was at a lot of Occupy encampments in his full like captain's outfit, and also went to Black Lives Matter protests. And the Fraternal Order of Police tried to get his pension taken away from him, because he talked about these issues, and he talked about how police are given empathy tests, and if they score too high, they're not allowed to go to the police academy. And he talked about how police are rewarded for being brutal. And so when we talk about policing, I think it's, we're talking about an institution that is there to serve and protect a genocidal, capitalistic, colonialistic, based on slavery system that how do you reform that? This institution is
right,
not there to serve and protect people. And as you pointed out, that's not their job. Their job is not to help a homeless guy get food. And so I did want to pick up on something that you mentioned, because I've been curious. Was live ammunition actually used in the forest that day, or were people accosted violently by less than lethal, which can of course be lethal rounds like rubber bullets and things like that?
in the day that Tortuguita was shot, yeah, Tortuguita was I mean, they had guns and they shot Tortuguita with live ammunition. Like the the rest of the people who were in the forest were primarily like assaulted with rubber bullets, pepper balls, um, rubber bullets and pepper balls. They're like, so they didn't use guns on everybody, but they had guns. Like there were, like it was like SWAT and these kinds of things. And so there were people who were hurt in the raid, but it was a lot of police officers. It was something like, dozens of cars. So it was, and they fully like closed off the whole area. So yeah, no one else was shot or shot at, to my knowledge. But they were mostly using other like crowd control techniques. I don't really know like why they well, anyway, yeah, it's sort of painful or like difficult to talk about, but there are some other things too that are just as deadly. Like, when there was the protest that was going on in downtown Atlanta, where that was also like called rioting, and the vandalism that took place. Like one of the protesters, there was video of one of the protesters, like where the person hears the cop car like screeched to a halt, and then like goes around the corner and sees the protester like on the ground in front of the cop car with the police officer like coming out of the car. So it's sort of unclear whether or not the police officer hit the person with their car, like going the wrong way down this one-way street in order to be able to arrest them. So I don't know. I think, and like we know that police officers in Atlanta, for example, like not too long ago, there was this story where they used something called a pit maneuver, where they killed this like 16-year-old and 15-year-old because they do this thing on the street where one of the cars, the police car that is chasing the other car, comes up behind and taps the back bumper of the side back bumper of the car they're chasing with the front bumper of their car, and it causes the car that they're chasing to spin out of control. And like that's a maneuver that is that's like other precincts in other parts of the country don't use it because it's so deadly for the people who are in the car, you know. And so the fact that they're doing those kinds of maneuvers, I wouldn't really be surprised if they were like, oh, now I have an opportunity to like hit people with my car, you know. Like it just seems like the police force, just from what we've heard on the scanners and from what we've seen, is not really like trying to protect the populace. They're like looking for excuses to be able to do the most violent things that they can legally do, you know, and looking for those kinds of justifications. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that one of the reasons that I wanted to invite you on here was because the police also control the narrative, because media is owned and operated by the corporate overlords who like police protection. So this is, and it, of course, with that, cops lie. It is actually like that's part of their job description to lie. And Stephen Donziger again shared another post that talked about how the Atlanta police had claimed that DHS had said that these forest defenders were domestic terrorists, and then DHS confirmed to the Washington Post that they never said any such thing. And if the Atlanta police are, if they're lying about that, what else are they lying about? Of course, the answer is, you know, name something. And so with that, as we wrap up here, Coyote, I also want to ask, since this is a platform that is for censored perspectives and frontline perspectives, what else would you like to let folks know, or what else would you like to share with the time that we have left?
Gosh. um, well, in regard to Tortuguita's death, and I think that this is kind of a story that has been going around, and so people may have seen this already, but they didn't find, like, you know, the gun that was submitted as evidence of like this is the gun that Tortuguita owned, and like, Tortuguita used this to shoot the officer. Was not like that photo, like the gun wasn't found until like hours after Tortuguita had been shot, right? So the and it's this kind of like, you know, well framed picture next to these cigarette butts or whatever, and blah blah blah. And so there are a lot of in Atlanta, and if you go to the community movement builders page, you can find an explanation of these cases, right? There are many cases where police officers have entered a home, right, that they're not supposed to be in, and the person, like in one case, I think she fired off some warning shots, you know. In another case, it was just totally the wrong home, and then like a dog like came out and startled the police officers. The police officers freaked out, killed the person, and shot each other. Like there were multiple cases where there was friendly fire, you know, and the when the officer down thing came out, when people heard Officer Down on the scanners, people like the organizers mostly thought that it was probably a case of friendly fire, because and then we found out about that somebody had died. We didn't know that it was Tortuguita until that night, like late that night. So the yeah, so I think the story that's currently going around is that Tortuguita randomly shot at one of these officers, and then they all shot Tortuguita, right? We don't really know what happened, you know. I do like think like even if the gun is Tortuguita's, like this is America, you're allowed to have guns, you know, like, and honestly, like I think the but like we don't really know what happened. We don't know we don't have any video, and I do think that like there's this pattern of lying, and then having like, and then you know, the police are always going to frame the story in whatever way allows them to get out of being in trouble, you know. Like there was another story that I heard about where police officers shot a man, and then they went into his home, and upon seeing that he had security cameras that like showed that they had wrongfully shot this man, they were like, oh shit, the camera. So the there definitely needs to be some kind of independent investigation, and hopefully the police officers haven't tampered with the evidence, which we know also happens. But we should know that, like, you know, Tortuguita's on record saying that nonviolent action is what really works, and that the likely like that everything that Tortuguita was doing was because they were truly trying to protect their neighbors and truly trying to protect the planet, and like really were very passionate about what they believed in, and that like we shouldn't allow them to have died in vain, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I asked this understanding that these are very rough times, but also because the other guest on this episode, Sasha from Germany, discussing Lützerath, made a point at the end. She said that she wanted to make sure that people understood that there was a lot of hope coming from this demolished town, and the potential 280 million tons of coal beneath it. And so I wanted to ask a similar question to you, because I thought that was a powerful statement that she left folks with. And so I'm wondering if, I mean, do you have hope at the moment for this movement, but also for the larger movement of forest defense and defending neighbors, and ultimately ending police violence?
Yeah, I do actually have hope. I'm like pretty optimistic, um, which sounds kind of crazy after talking about what just happened, but you know, the when there was the summit, and you know, some of the Muskogee spiritual leaders and elders came and spoke to us, right? What they talked about was that what was necessary wasn't just stopping this facility from being built and preventing the forest from being destroyed, but a cultural shift in people, you know, like a shift in our values, a shift in how we see each other and how we see other living things, you know. Like they talked about the importance of like seeing like the trees, the plants, and the animals as our relatives, right? And protecting them as we would protect our relatives, you know, and how there is something like inherently just in that. And when I see how indigenous voices are being centered in a lot of media and getting a lot of sort of like they're being broadcasted and increased in volume. And I see things like what's going on with Lutzeroth, like there were vigils in solidarity with Tortuguita, like in South America and in Europe and in Palestine and all across the United States, like many continent, like it was an international thing. Like people are, at least definitely young people, are on the same page. Like we like can we it feels good to me because I no matter what, like I know that the like the capitalist, like colonial billionaire whatever like thing is really like really trying to grab hold, and I know that like this like Cop City thing is just a part of that. It's about them trying to control land and control a populace of people, and like hopefully be able to like for themselves, like hopefully defend their castles from like the masses when like climate change starts making everything go crazy. But like this, like the fact like that the the anarchist phone tree extends so far, like food not bombs is all around the world. Like you can open a slingshot planner and you can find like groups of people like all over the world who are all trying to like, okay, like if you need housing and you can't rent because all the landlords are assholes, like let's find you a squat. Like if you need food, like there's a food not bombs. If you need like medicine, there are street medics, or there are like alternative forms of care, like herbalists and these kinds of things. And so like the the masses are all in this place where I think that we're learning to be self-sufficient, and we're learning to be like, actually, you know what, no, we don't want to take your shit anymore. And so that makes me feel optimistic, because like um even if, no matter how much they like try and squash people, you know, all the cases where they've tried to squash people before, like eventually the squashers lose, you know. So that makes me feel optimistic. And I think that the cultural shift that we're seeing, that those folks that, Dan Wildcat and others were asking for, like that the fact that that's really happening makes me feel a lot better, because hopefully if it happens like in a dispersed way, it will make a really big difference, and we can stop trying to rely, we can forget about like asking politicians or the people at the top to like save us, or that they're thinking that they're going to do something, like they're just lying. We should ignore them and do our own thing. And like clearly people are doing their own thing. They're taking over town, they're like occupying towns, they're occupying forests. So yeah, I feel optimistic.
Well, rad. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining the show again. I really
Hmm.
appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.